Welcome to the Health Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, as part of the National Health Association. And tonight, I'm so pleased and excited to have as my guest Dr. Will Tuttle. And Dr. Will is the author of The World Peace Diet, which we're going to get into because it's so profound. Will has a PhD. He also has been involved in a number of very profound videos and documentaries like A Prayer for Compassion, which is one of my favorites, Cowspiracy. And he has dedicated his life to sharing the vegan message and the message of ahimsa. And I really want to get involved in some beautiful discussions with him tonight about all of that. So welcome, Will. It's such a pleasure to see you. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world, championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Thank you so much, Frank. It's great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for listening in. Great to be here.
Your biography, when I go through it, is so fascinating because it reminds me of the old Robert Frost poem about two roads diverging in the woods, and you took the road less traveled, and that's kind of made all the difference in your life. And, your interests that expand from, philosophy to veganism to religious traditions. I think it's remarkable to see that integration. And I guess that was in the stars when I noticed in your biography, you learned to swim in Thoreau's Walden Pond. I said, when he learned to swim in Walden Pond, I think his life was kind of set forth on this philosophical path, so to speak, So anyhow, I noticed that, early on in your life, you had been interested in spiritual exploration. Let's just call it that. And you early on, went on your own little pilgrimage and actually got turned on to vegetarianism in a very iconic place that was founded by Stephen and Ina Mae Gaskin at the farm, which is something that was kind of a special place for me when I hung out with a number of midwives who were so influenced by Ina Mae. So I saw that was one of the turning points for your movement into vegetarianism. And then that led, of course, into the direction of other spiritual growth and eventually even being involved in very intense Zen and Buddhist studies where you actually lived in a monastery as a Zen monk in Korea. Talk a little bit about that whole journey for you, because I think it's such a fascinating journey that people, it's so foreign to the way most people would live their lives. And I think there's instruction of how that journey informed, where you are in your heart and in your spiritual space. Can you talk to that just a little bit?
Right. Well, thank you, Frank. You've done a wonderful job of kind of summarizing some of the salient points. But yeah, I was born and raised in Concord, Massachusetts, back in the 1950s and early 60s. I remember growing up there and learning to swim in Walden Pond. There was the whole transcendentalist movement was very alive with Emerson Hospital was where I was born, Alcott School, and the transcendentalists were really the first ones to bring teachings from Asia into North America. Thoreau had the largest library of books on Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism, and so forth. And part of their explorations was actually vegetarianism, and they had a vegan commune. It wasn't called vegan, of course, but it was a community called Fruitlands back in the 1840s, where there was no meat or dairy or eggs, no wool, silk, leather, or even any cotton, because they were trying to live a life of justice, and they didn't want to be buying something that was slave labor from the South. So they were walking through the snowdrifts of Concord, Massachusetts in shoes made out of linen. So they were, hardcore, what we would call today vegans, I guess, way back then. And I think on some level, when I get to college and I started reading some of Emerson and Thoreau's works more in depth, and Alcott too later, I felt a strong resonance with what they were connecting with, which was really sort of a back to nature, and connect with meditation and inner silence, which was very different from the robust sort of outward-looking, expansionistic, individualistic mentality of the United States at that time. And the thing that was interesting to me, I guess, when I look back on it, is that I was raised in a family eating the usual meals of lots of meat, dairy, and eggs. But I remember starting to question it a little bit when I was about 7, and I asked my mother what the food we were eating, you know, all this meat, dairy, and eggs, if that was what everybody in the world ate, if that was pretty typical food. And at first she said, yes, that's pretty typical. But then she changed her mind and she said, well, it's not totally true because there are vegetarians. But then she immediately said, but don't, I said, what's a vegetarian? And she just said, well, you know, don't worry about it. You're never going to meet one. I don't know where they get their protein. You know, so I had this basic impression of vegetarians being very sickly and weak and probably not getting enough protein and being very rare and so forth. So when I went away to college, though, eventually I began to think about it a little bit because I was starting to really explore enthusiastically meditation. I started doing yoga. This was back in the early 70s in Maine, at Colby College in Maine. And so my brother and I, my younger brother Ed, decided to take a pilgrimage, like in the old tradition, I guess they did in India, where we would just walk and meditate without money. And we thought we would just walk west to California and see, you know, and get there eventually. We thought that if we could reach California, this was 1975, that we would probably attain cosmic consciousness, just being in California. But we got as far as Buffalo and it got cold and we thought, well, better head south. So we actually walked all the way down through upstate New York and Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, and into Tennessee. And that's where, as you say, we spent some time at the farm, which was the largest hippie commune in the world back in 1975, founded really by mostly people in California, with the spiritual teachers being Stephen Gaskin and his wife Ina Mae Gaskin. Very wonderful people, really. But they were all vegetarians, this whole 900 people living there. And today we would call them vegans. They called themselves vegetarians because that word was unknown back in, the word vegan was unknown back in 1975. But they weren't eating any dairy products or eggs as part of their discipline. And it was really based on two main things. One was to eat lower on the food chain so there would be enough food for everyone to eat, because it was becoming better understood that it's very wasteful to grow all this corn and soy and other grains and feed them to cows and pigs and chickens and factory farm fishes while people are starving. And they said, we want to help create world peace, so we're eating lower on the food chain so there's enough for everyone to eat. And then they also filled me in a little bit about the terrible violence and cruelty to animals who are used for food. And at the same time, provided this wonderful example at 900 people, and I was eating with them every day, meals of lots of vegetables and grains and soybeans back then. It was the main things we were eating. So that was it. I basically never ate meat in my life after being there and learning from these people about what's going on behind the curtain of our society. And many years later, I met my wonderful wife, Madeline, from Switzerland, in Switzerland, and I found out that the same month and year she also decided to never eat meat in her life at the same time. And it was very wonderful to meet her later. But in the meantime, I did get out to California. I started living in meditation centers, a Tibetan Buddhist meditation center for several years, and then the Zen centers, really, primarily. And I became a Zen Buddhist monk in 1984. And so I remember going to Songwangsa Zen Monastery. I became a vegan actually in 1980 when I became more aware of the violence towards animals, especially for dairy cows and hens. So I became a vegan in 1980. But when I went to Songwangsa, the Zen monastery in South Korea in 1984, I realized I was in a community for the second time in my life that was vegan, totally vegan. And they had been practicing veganism at Songwangsa for about 750 years. So it was this ancient tradition. And it was very powerful to just be there and be in a community where there was no testing on animals. I mean, no products that would involve any suffering to animals. That was the basic idea. We were practicing ahimsa, which is the old Sanskrit word that means nonviolence. And the basic idea is just that if we're serious about spiritual evolution, about health, about creating a society peace and harmony and justice, then eating animal foods goes completely contrary to all of that, because we have to harm other beings, very wasteful of resources. It goes against everything that is spiritual. It goes against the golden rule, because we all know, anyone who has a companion animal like a dog or a cat, you know that these are not just sacks of cement. These are beings that we're selling them like they're sacks of cement. We sell them like they're, by the pound, but they are just as sentient, really, as we are. They have interests that are as important to them as our interests are to us. And so that was a wonderful affirmation and deepening, really, of the vegan roots that were still kind of new at that point. And so now I've been a vegan since 1980, which is, as you know, the years fly by, so over 40 years. But I always say it was the smartest thing I ever did, besides marrying my wonderful wife, Madeline, and finding that we can thrive, not just be as healthy, but really far healthier on a plant-based diet, and especially, as you know, mostly whole foods and living foods and organic and so forth, to do it properly. And it's really a celebration. So I'm very grateful for the way that the spiritual wisdom of the ancient traditions combines really with what we know today in science, that this is what we're designed for, and the more we do that, the better it is for everyone.
Yeah, and the way, you talk about ahimsa, and you make an important point, because the roots of ahimsa, which are the roots of veganism, which really are about, supporting the sanctity of all life and the divine right of all creatures to live without harm, goes back as far as the 9th century into Jainism and Hinduism and Buddhism, and so it becomes a modern expression of that in terms of veganism. I noticed when you came back from that journey, you went and got your PhD, and what I read was educating intuition and altruism is what I read in your biography. And educating intuition sounds a little bit like an oxymoron to me, because education always seems to be very didactic and very planned and, more rigid, when intuition is about being free of the bondage of those shackles, so to speak. So tell me about what that actually means, educating intuition. How do you educate the intuitive side of things within a person?
Right. Yeah, well, the word education, ironically enough, comes from the old Latin word ex and educare, which means to draw out or to draw forth. So we practice education kind of the opposite of that. We're kind of stuffing in, facts and figures and testing students and so forth. But the original meaning of education is to draw forth from our inner wisdom what is within us. And that goes right along with intuition development, I think. And the basic idea is that we human beings, we do have these two capacities. We have the capacity to be rational and logical and analytical and use our intellect in that way. It's a way of knowing that's based on dividing and separating, where the knower and the known are always separate.
Right.
But there is this other way of knowing that's basically completely ignored in our society, especially in academia, which is intuition. Intuition comes from intuere, which means learning from within, or learning by looking within. And so the basic idea with intuition is that we have within us already the capacity to know directly. So instead of having a separation between the knower and the known, intuition is the knowing that arises when the wall between myself and the world begins to dissolve, when I know directly by connecting. So it has to do with connecting. And I think a lot of people are intuitive more than they realize. And to me, for example, going vegan had a lot to do with that. It's actually seeing what's there, but which our rational mind kind of blinds us to. We can rationalize anything. We can run a story and talk about how well we need to eat meat to have protein, and these animals are inferior to us, and all of these kinds of stories. But our intuition, when the wall comes down, we actually see another living being, and we know directly that harming them is really harming ourselves. So I think that we face in our society today what I refer to as an intuitive imperative, that it's imperative for us really as individuals and as the society to reconnect with our intuition. So my PhD dissertation actually was on educating intuition primarily in adults. And I was able to bring in a lot of the work and the research I had done in Buddhist studies to show that we do have what every tradition really refers to as a feminine capacity. The World Peace Diet, I talk about it as Sophia. Sophia was the ancient Greek goddess of wisdom and represents the inner feminine capacity that we all have, whether we are men or women, to be receptive to a higher knowing. There's goddesses of wisdom like Prajna in the Buddhist tradition, Saraswati in the Hindu tradition, Shekinah in the Jewish tradition. These wisdom deities are typically feminine or female because it's the capacity to be receptive, it was being cultivated. And the beautiful thing is that when we cultivate that, then our masculine capacity, or the capacity to be actually effective and active and creative, is much more powerful. They reinforce each other. The more we can be receptive and connect with inner wisdom, the more authentically we can be creative. And so this is really important, I think, to understand, because when we cut down and suppress the sacred feminine dimension of consciousness, which is really what happens in our society with eating animal foods, we just don't want to think about these animals. We shut down our intuition. We just become dull, and we don't care, and we numb ourselves, really. So veganism, to me, is reactivating and reawakening and resurrecting Sophia, resurrecting the sacred feminine capacity to know directly. And when that happens, we become more powerful, more creative, more happy, more joyful, more connected with our purpose. All these things get turned on. And so it really creates this terrific adventure, not just a taste adventure or an adventure of being healthier, but an adventure of spirituality and discovery and awakening and living life authentically. Because without that, what's the point of being healthy? I mean, why be healthy if all I'm doing is making money and caring about myself? Like, what? So what? So I'm just part of the problem. So the whole idea is to go to a deeper level and find our purpose.
Two questions come to mind. When you awaken that intuitive side of things, or the intuitive process within yourself, and you're cutting through the fragmentation that is much a part of the dichotomy of how we're brought up to look at the world, this or that, things are separated, boundaries that really shouldn't be boundaries are there. Do you feel that altruism and the higher ideals of compassion, empathy, and love become a natural outgrowth of that? Or do you have to adopt something like a vegan way of eating to give it the push in that direction? Do you feel that it's an a priori outcome, or does it still need that impetus of working with eating and living habits that promote that outcome? That's the first question. So can you address that? And then I have a second question.
Yeah, for that first question, that's actually a very sophisticated question that is very important also, because, like, for example, as a Zen monk, just as one example, there are all these vows that we take. We take vows not to kill, to steal, to lie, to abuse others sexually, or anything like that. And so, and the whole idea is that if we engage in behavior that harms others, then when we go to meditate, we won't be able to go very deeply. Our mind will be busy and fragmented and so forth. So in order to reach a more peaceful and wise state, we're called to act in kind and loving ways. And so we can have these rules in place, in a sense, to help us do that. And every spiritual tradition does have moral codes, has ethical codes, does have the golden rule and so forth. Don't do to others what you don't want to have done to yourself. This is really important. So some people think, well, if I just do my meditation practice and so forth, and work on my spiritual path, then I'll go vegetarian. Eventually, I'll go vegan. When it's time, then I'll do it, right? But I think we should see that we can actually change our behavior and act in ways that are kind and loving. And then we'll find that that will help our spirituality grow much, much better. Because I've seen so many times people on a spiritual path are still eating animal foods, and they're thinking that they'll get to it eventually. So there's a very profound saying in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which is that when your view becomes as vast as the sky, then your behavior should be as fine as finely ground flour. Our awareness. That's a very important point. We tend to think that, when I really am totally enlightened, then I can just act however I want. And actually, I mean, on a certain level, it's true when when we wake up, we see that others are not separate from ourselves. But it's very dangerous, I think, and really for anyone to harm others unnecessarily. It really puts a block in our path that we don't realize. So moving into a vegan way of living, for example, if we call it vegan, I would say ahimsa way of living, to do the best we can to be kind and loving, not just to animals, but to human animals. I mean, in everything, how we're living our life, is really essential. And so many vegans, people who are living, a so-called vegan life, still have a long way to go in doing that. I mean, we can still be shaming and blaming and criticizing and attacking other people because we're not on an actual spiritual path of developing ahimsa authentically beyond just the rules that we have about our food. So it's kind of like asking, which is more important, the roots of the tree or the branches of the tree? You know, in order for the roots to grow, the branches have to grow, but in order for the branches to grow, the roots have to grow. You know, so it's kind of like it really should happen together. The two things, you know.
I'm here with Dr. Will Tuttle. We're going to take a very short break to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association, and we'll be right back. And now, to put a smile on the sponsors of the National Health Association, you're listening to the Health Science Podcast Show. I want to remind you to visit the National Health Association website, where you'll find incredible resources to support your healthy lifestyle, including plant-exclusive eating, without added salt, oil, and sugar. Simply go to healthscience.org or nationalhealthassociation.org. Be sure to check out membership, which is $35 per year for those living within the U.S. and $55 for those living outside the U.S. You'll be amazed at all the information and benefits you'll receive. As a member, you're kept up to date on the latest evidence-based tools for health promotion. You'll receive the incomparable quarterly magazine Health Science, a beautiful 40-page advertising-free publication mailed to your home or offices, loaded with articles, recipes, inspirational stories, and interviews with world leaders in the fields of personal health, plant-based nutrition, water-only fasting, animal rights, and environmental support. And you'll receive details about life-changing events, such as the 2023 NHA conference set for June 23 to the 25th, 2023 in Cleveland, Ohio, which will be the NHA's 75th annual NHA conference. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and now back to the show. Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. I'm here with my special guest, Dr. Will Tuttle, and we're talking about really a philosophy of living in a way that cuts through the old concept of materialism and dichotomies and fragmentation. And a really good path to that is embracing the vegan consciousness and the vegan way of life. So with that in mind, let me go right into what was your motivation then and what led to the World Peace Diet book, the book that you wrote, which really has resonated and has been involved in 50 states, 50 countries, translated into 17 languages, probably even more by now. So it really, obviously, it touched the nerve, it touched the heart of people throughout the world. So talk to me about your path to writing that book and what were you trying to convey through that medium?
Thank you. Thanks, Frank. Yeah, the thing behind writing the World Peace Diet essentially was to just give the biggest possible picture of the consequences of animal agriculture, which is really the living core of our society. So one of the main reasons I wrote it was I realized that people just are not aware that the living core that's spinning like a fury at the core of our culture is animal agriculture, that we're killing every single day. Just in the United States alone, 75 million animals, we're just killing them every day. It's a vast operation causing enormous suffering, and it's just business as usual, and we tend to just ignore it. And so I know people are somewhat aware that it causes suffering, and it's not very good for our health, and it has environmental implications that are pretty bad. And so that's understood, but I realized that there's much more to it than that through the research that I did at UC Berkeley in anthropology and sociology and psychology, social psychology, in public health and nutrition and economics and politics. And then also in my spiritual research, I guess you'd say, in just thousands of hours of meditation and so forth, I realized that animal agriculture it's like a Trojan horse. It looks very friendly. It's how the West was won. It's how we get our protein. It's how God set it up. We have it in the Bible everywhere. It's sort of more or less okay to do. We have this permission. But I realized, no, we actually do not have permission. And what we're doing is not only harming these animals, but everything we do to them boomerangs right back on us in ways that we don't realize, that are often very poetic. Like we sow tremendous seeds of obesity. We have whole armies of scientists trying to maximize obesity in cows and pigs and chickens because that's how you make money. They're sold by the pound. So we sow those seeds and we reap an obesity epidemic that's still increasing. I just read today that the number of states with people who are obese, over 35%, has gone from 16 up to 19 just in the last year. So it's still increasing because we're sowing the seeds of cancer, of osteoporosis. We're breaking down their families. We're forcing them to live in toxic environments. We do all these things and we find it boomerangs back on us, and it's causing the same thing. So in many ways, I was banging a warning bell, in writing the World Peace Diet to say it's really essential that we understand that there's no reason to eat animal foods, that all the nutrients that we need to thrive and celebrate our lives here on this beautiful earth, we can get without causing any suffering to animals. I'm an example, and there's literally millions of other people who are long-term vegans who are just as healthy or healthier than the general population. So it was to basically take our routine mistreatment of animals for food, which most people will admit, they'll say it is the problem. We shouldn't do that to animals. But on the long list of problems that we have, like we have hunger and war, environmental devastation, and all these different problems that we're facing and disease, we have human violence to animals is pretty far down on the list for most people. They think, well, we'll get to that eventually, but not right now. We have more important things. And I wrote the World Peace Diet in a sense to take our treatment of animals and take it from the bottom of the list to the top of the list. Like if we address that, everything else will take care of itself. I mean, a lot of it will. If we would really take care of that, we would find a massive positive change in the other things.
Well, what's interesting in the United States, in the criminal justice system, which you wouldn't think would be as tuned into this, there's something called the link, and even the FBI uses it. And what they've noticed is that people who have a penchant for violence to animals, even household animals, have a real penchant for violence to their partners and humans that they encounter. So this connection, this link that happens when you breed and foster this mentality of violence, I think people need to understand that this is ubiquitous across all species at that point. And it needs to be nipped in whatever bud it can be nipped, because there is no place for it in a sentient society. And the other thing is that when you think about it, when people have illnesses or sicknesses, their world gets smaller and smaller. It actually gets more fragmented, because what happens is there's more fear, there's more narcissistic self-absorption in your own survival, and you lose sight of the consequence of choices you may be making in eating foods and the foods you're using and the foods you're preparing and the things you're doing routinely. So talk to how the plant-based eating, the vegan approach, affects psychological and spiritual health directly. I know that you've thought a lot about it, you've written about it. Let's address that even a little further, because to me, cutting through the religiosity of it all, many people have spoken, or some people have spoken, of spirituality as basically the essential of seeing something outside of yourself, having concern for something outside of your own vested interest and self-absorption, to make it simple. So how does this way of eating, these food choices, feed both psychological and spiritual health? Let's talk about that briefly, if we can.
Right. Yeah, that's getting right to the heart of the whole thing. That's the main point I like to really make, is that eating animal foods is not only devastating to the outer world, like to our physical body, to the environment, and to our society, but to the inner landscape of our awareness, because we're forced basically to adopt attitudes that are not in our best interests. One of the main attitudes that we all have, that is basically reinforced in us as we're sitting at the table eating animal flesh and dairy products and eggs, is the mentality of disconnectedness. the underlying text or narrative of every meal is don't make the connection. We're eating bacon, we're eating cheese, that's all it is. Don't think any deeper. We don't want to think deeper. If we do, then we'll suddenly think, oh no, I'm eating misery and violence and toxicity. So this is a ritual, and anthropologists understand that it is the primary ritual in every society, actually, that in terms of transmitting values from generation to generation, are meals. Meals are the way that we transmit our values. There's a narrative that we not only talk about, but that we're eating. So we're actually eating this narrative of disconnectedness. And part of my PhD at Berkeley was studying intelligence. And intelligence is actually defined as the ability to make connections, the ability to make relevant connections. So if we have the main ritual in our society is eroding our capacity to make connections 3 times a day, then it's eroding the intelligence of our entire society. And that's what's happened. Unfortunately, we can see it around us. What are we doing with our intelligence? We're creating more destruction and more violence in many ways. It's because animal agriculture erodes not just our cognitive intelligence, but also our emotional intelligence. It makes us numb. We don't want to think about, we don't want to care about, we don't want to look deeply or care deeply. And so that's also reducing our spiritual intelligence. And the main thing, you use that word, which I think is so important, which is materialism. Animal agriculture really enforces a mentality of materialism. We're buying and selling beings by the pound. You can't get more materialistic than that in a philosophical sense. And so when materialism starts taking over, then we start to look at everything as an instrument to be used for my own benefit. And so we don't have relationships that honor each other as humans so much anymore. We're trying to always manipulate each other to get what we want. And this creates more fragmentation and conflict and in the society. It creates more illness and disease and more stress. So it's really a self-generating negative spiral. When you start committing violence towards animals, you start creating attitudes. There's many of them. I list about 7 or 8. That's one of the big ones. Another big one, of course, is might makes right. The basic idea in every meal is those who are powerful can dominate and exploit those who are weak. Another that goes with that is privilege and elitism. The subtext of every meal is that certain beings are inherently superior to other beings. And since we're the inherently superior, it's fine for us to dominate the inherently inferior. So even though on the surface, we talk about how we want to create a society of justice and equality, we don't make any progress. We have more injustice today probably than ever. And the reason is that we're eating injustice, and it becomes the very cells of our body. And so this deep ritualized being pushed in a way that's not in our best interest is invisible to most people. And then I mentioned earlier, another part of the damage that's done is just the suppression of Sophia, the sacred feminine dimension with every meal, which is the sacred power that we have to care for, like mothers care for their children. And that ability to care deeply for others is essential to our health, to the health of our families, to the health of our society. But again, with animal agriculture, every meal is telling us don't care about the cows, don't care about hungry people, don't care about the workers who have to stab animals all day. I'm just glad I don't have to do it. I don't care about them. Don't care about future generations. Don't care about indigenous people. Don't care about ecosystems. I mean, it's really a massive attack on this capacity of caring, which is the sacred feminine dimension. So all of these things erode our natural spirituality, which is seeing that we're all interconnected, that there's one life that lives through all of us. And as we bless others, actually, we're blessing ourselves. And the more we harm others, we actually end up harming ourselves more and more. And that is something I think that the ancients understood, and we've lost sight of that because of our materialism. And veganism, I think, is a vehicle for us to understand that, but it's not necessarily so. Some vegans are anti-spiritual and they don't make those connections. So we really have to consciously, that's one of the reasons I wrote the World Peace Diet, was not only for people who are pre-vegans and to understand, but also people who are vegans to take it to a more authentic, deeper level to understand really what it's all about.
Well, this is talking and speaking to I'm feeling what you write about as radical inclusion, this need to
Yeah.
talk about that. How do you define that in your work, radical inclusion? It comes through as one of your working models, one of the things you're trying to bring to a violent, fragmented culture. So talk about what that means to you.
Right. Well, essentially, the essential mentality of animal agriculture is exclusion, right? We just exclude cows and pigs and chickens and all these other and slaughterhouse workers and hungry people. We just exclude others. And so the natural tendency, really, I think, for us as we grow in awareness, spiritually and emotionally, I think even intellectually, if we're doing it authentically, is to become more inclusive, to see that other beings have interests, and that we are together essentially on this earth, that the more we take into account the welfare of other beings, the better it is for all of us. And so that sense of inclusion uh, is essential. The problem that we're having, I think, essentially, is that we do have a capacity to be rational. We do have a capacity to be empathetic, but those are both submerged under tribalism. Now, tribalism is this idea of my group. I want to fit in. I just want to, at all costs, I want to be like people around me. I want people to like me. I want to be able to eat what they're eating. I don't want to be different. I want to just comply with the basic way of the tribal narrative. And so that tribalism forces us in many ways to shut down our empathy and our rationality and to just fit in. So inclusiveness is basically stepping outside of the tribal mentality and say, well, I'm going to include people of other tribes, other nations, other political parties, maybe other races, genders, everything else. But beyond that, other species, right? Just the whole web of life. We begin to feel this beautiful sense of gratitude for being part of a web of life that is eternal and magnificent, and caring about the whole thing.
Well, it's interesting that even in the work of science, even in the work of quantum physics, they talk about the fact that there's no way to know where one creature ends and the other begins. There's no way to know where the Arab ends and the Jew begins. There's no way to know where the Protestant Catholic and the Protestant and the Catholic Irishman begin and end. There's no way to know where the cow ends and we end. So the idea of connection is really fundamental. It's the fundamental reality of life, and yet that fragmentation has been the way that we found the need maybe to survive at one point. Maybe you need to attach to a tribe at one point in the distant past, because if you didn't, maybe
Right.
there wasn't enough food, or you had protection against other creatures. But as we evolve, this idea of social network and expanding the idea of connectiveness is the only way now that we're going to be able to survive. Because if we keep coming from the place of fragmentation, there will be no planet, there will be no species, and there will be no humanity left unless we can find a way to bridge that gap. I'm here with Dr. Will Tuttle, and Will, where do you want people to go to find you? Where would they go on the web or on the internet? What's the location where they can go to find you?
Sure. It's pretty straightforward. Either my name, willtuttle.com, or the main book, worldpeacediet.com. Either one of those will take you right to our videos that we have. My wonderful wife, Madeline, has lots of food preparation videos. We have videos of lectures and interviews, and also our tour schedule. We're giving lots of events year round, and also articles I've been writing and new books that are coming out and all that kind of stuff. I'm happy to.
Well, you and I have one passion in common, and that is music. And I want to talk
great.
about this with you because in your journey, you have integrated in a very important way in your life the music that you create and even the artwork that your wife creates as a way to bring people into this idea of inclusion, bringing them into a broader picture of creativity as it works through a consciousness of integration. Talk about how you've done that in your own path, and
Well,
why,
yeah,
why it was so important to you.
right. Well, to me, it's essential because the, the intuition comes through as creativity in many ways, and to me, music is a language of feeling, and it speaks directly to people beyond thoughts. And so I found very often when I just play the piano, not only does it open up my own heart to higher wisdoms that come, understandings and insights, but it also seems to open doorways to just make better connections with other human beings. People's walls begin to soften, and we begin to realize that we're not essentially separate. So music and art both, I think, can be used as powerful tools of healing. We've been giving, thousands of concerts over the years, individual sessions for people. We actually create healing music for individuals and couples and art. And we do workshops on the healing power of music as well. I mean, it's a huge subject, but even the AMA actually sees that music can have healing capacity. So that's something that's very important to understand. And I was born into a musical family. My father taught me to play the piano, and now I just get out of the way. It's like a meditation. I just play, and the music comes through, and it has a tremendous gift. Yeah.
Music is a universal language,
right?
That cuts across all boundaries.
Right.
Lines of countries, boundary lines of races, boundary lines of tribes, and people resonate with that. So it really is a very useful approach to cut through fragmentation and enhance connectedness. So I applaud you for doing that, because it's a very powerful way to really do that. So the question then is, when we're talking to people out here, what's the way that they can contribute to the world peace that we need to have? What's the thing that someone needs to do day by day, day to day, in their working reality to feed this kind of outcome, where we can enhance the feminine, where we can, promote the inclusion that's necessary to cut through the violence and fragmentation that have been imposed on us all from birth? What can the person do day to day? How do you envision that?
I think the main thing is what we've been talking about, the two things. Number one, to really actually practice eating as much as possible a totally whole foods, plant-based diet, and organic, locally grown as much as possible. Grow food yourself or support local farmers. That's critical. And then make an effort to have an inner spiritual practice where you quiet your mind. I think quieting the mind, taking time every day to meditate and just be aware of the witness to consciousness. So what we are is watching the thoughts and watching our life unfold, and being aware that what we are is what makes this body possible. We're not just this physical body. We're born into a society where we're really wounded by being told that we're just this body, this thing that will die, this thing that was born and will die. But when we understand that we're the infinite and eternal consciousness that makes this possible, then we realize a much bigger picture of this life. And we realize that we're just here for a few decades, and we can learn and grow and contribute and be part of the solutions to the problems here. And rather than being lost in this fear-based mentality of being just a thing that's going to die and has to try to then struggle with others in that way.
I used to love the line by Virginia Satir, one of the family therapists, talking about when we meditate and do those things that bring us into that inner space. She said we get to encounter that divine sacred space within ourselves that is called by our name. And I love that. I love that statement by her, because your point is so well made. The more we create a connection to that deeper divine space that really exists within each of us, the more we can then bring that out into the external world to make the kinds of changes that you, in fact, are talking about, and that are very, very profound. So before we break, do you have any words of input or wisdom that you'd like to share with our audience out here?
Oh, I just want to encourage everyone to question all the official narratives in our society, especially the ones that we've internalized ourselves, and see life as an adventure. That every day we can wake up in the morning and give thanks for another opportunity to be part of the solution here, and let our light shine. And as we do that, we create a better world for all of us. That's really what it's all about.
With all that beautiful gratitude, which we all need to have on a daily basis. Absolutely. I want to really thank Dr. Tuttle for really spending his time, giving his time and energy to share his information and his insight and his wisdom with us. I encourage you to follow him. The website and the URL will be in our show notes, which you can see. I also want to thank our audience out there, because without you, none of this could be possible. I couldn't do what I do. On behalf of the National Health Association, I want to thank you for being part of this active community, moving in the kinds of directions that we've talked about tonight. And I'm Dr. Frank Sabatino, the Director of Health Education for the NHA. I want to thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing you on the next podcast. You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.